So we got multiple states to manage, and as you learned, that can be done with useReducer. It could also be done with useState somehow, but with useReducer, it's much easier. So we'll call useReducer here in the new place component, and now we need to set up a reducer function here, and I'll name it formReducer. The name is up to you though, and just as before, it's a function that receives a state and an action, and then needs to return a new state. We can pass formReducer here to useReducer. Initially here, I also want to have an initial state, and there I want to have two properties in my state. So my state is an object, and I want to have an inputs property, and I want to have a isValid property. My idea here is that isValid stores the information whether the overall form is valid. And inputs is a nested object that stores information about the validity of the individual inputs. So in my case, title. And here I want to use the IDs I assign to these inputs. That will make updating easier later. So title and description. And title then is an object again, where we have, let's say, the value, initially set to an empty string, and then isValid for that individual input, initially set to false. And now I will copy that and add the same here for description. And isValid of the overall form initially also is false. So this is the initial state. This is then the state we need to update inside of the formReducer based on the different actions we might receive. So again, we can switch on the action type to follow that same pattern as before. We can specify a default case here where we just return the unchanged state. And of course, I also want to handle a case here, and there I will handle the input change case, let's say. But that's totally up to you how you name that. In there, of course, we will return a new object, a new state object. And here we need to update a couple of things. We need to update the input state, which changed, and the overall form validity state. So let's run some logic in there. And that's the idea why we have reducers. We can run more complex logic to derive our required state update. I'll add a helper variable, form isValid, which initially is true. And then I want to go through all the inputs I have in my form here, in my form state, and find out if all these inputs are valid. So I'll go through all the inputs in state.inputs. Remember that our state here has an inputs property. So I'll go through all the inputs stored there with a for in loop because I'm going through an object. And then here I check if the input I'm currently looking at, and keep in mind this is in the end the input ID here, right? So we could name this input ID because I'm going through the inputs, so I'm going through title and description, and that is what will be stored here in input ID. I check if that is equal to, let's say, action input ID. So I'm effectively looking at the inputs and checking the input I'm currently looking at, is that the input which is getting updated here in this current action? If that is the case, I will take the information from the dispatched action on whether it is valid or not. So I'll then set form isValid equal to form isValid and action.isValid. So if that input change for the given input is valid. Else, if I'm looking at an input in my form state, which is not currently getting updated through the currently running action, well, then I will set form isValid equal to form isValid and state inputs for the input ID we're currently looking at is valid. So basically, I take the stored value, the stored validity for this input, because it is the input we're not currently updating with this action. And this approach here makes sure that I always take the previous value of form isValid and combine this with the new validity value. And if that is false, this will be set to false, and false with false or false with true will always yield false. True, which is my initial state, with false, however, will yield false, whereas true and true will keep true. So that ensures that if we have at least one false validity anywhere, the overall form validity becomes false. And with that, after the for loop, we return our new state here. And there, I want to copy my existing state first of all, and then set inputs equal to the current input state. So I'm copying that as well. But then I want to override the input state for the input we're updating with this action. And this action has an input ID field. That's my expectation. So we'll use this dynamic assignment here and change the key input ID here, so of the input ID passed with the action, to be a new object where the value is action.value and isValid is action.isValid. So this dynamically updates one of our fields in this inputs, as it should be, in this inputs object. So for example, if we dispatch an action with an ID, an input ID of title, then we would in the end see title in here and update the title input with a new value and a new validity and leave the description input untouched. Well, and then I also want to set isValid here, so the overall form validity, to form isValid. That is my reducer logic. Quite complex, but it should ensure that we update the information about the inputs and the overall form validity. Now, just as before, useReducer returns values. So I will use array destructuring to get these values. And the first value is my form state. The second value is a dispatch function, just as we had it inside of the input. And now in the title input handler, I want to call dispatch and dispatch a new action where I set the type equal to input change. That's the type I'm looking for in my reducer. So I will set this type here. And I provide a value here because I try to extract a value from action here and later also isValid and the input ID here. So we need to pass these three pieces of information. Value, of course, is the value I get here. IsValid is, well, the information I get here as an argument. And input ID is the ID here. So now we actually have a flexible, reusable input handler. So we can just name it input handler, get rid of the description input handler, and simply bind this input handler here to both the title input as well as the description input. Because we get all the information we need inside of that function anyways, so no need to create multiple functions. Now here, dispatch would technically be a dependency and you can add it, but React ensures that dispatch from useReducer never changes, so you can also omit it. And with that, we are, hopefully, managing the overall form validity. So let's go back to our new place component here. And in there, let's now utilize this form validity. For example, by adding a button at the bottom, and for that, we first of all need to import it. So here, I'll import button from shared components, form elements button, and add this button inside of the rendered form after all these inputs, here maybe, set the type to submit, and set disabled equal to not form state is valid. So when the form is not valid, the button should be disabled. And then on the button, I'll have a caption of add place. And now if everything works the way it should, this button indeed should be disabled whenever our form is not valid. So let's save this and let's have a look. This reloads, we got two inputs, and initially the button is disabled. Now if I enter something here, this is valid, but the button is still disabled. If I tap in here, we get our error, button is disabled. If I enter something here which has at least 5 characters, everything gets enabled though. So it looks like this is indeed working in the way it should. If both is valid, we can tap the button, and right now we don't handle the form submission properly, but that will change. But if at least one input is invalid, the button is disabled because our overall form state seems to be invalid. So that is working as it should with the help of useReducer and all the logic we have here. Now we're not done, of course. Now let's also handle the form submission.